Welcome, everybody. This is Unite Now. This is basically conversations at the crossroads of leadership and flourishing. And today we're going to spend some time up on the topic of immigration. And before we continue on this topic, I want to introduce our panel. We have David Park, pastor at Open Table Community Church. We have our immigration expert, Matthew Soerens, that we're going to hear about him in a few moments. And also we have with us Ruth Evans, Executive Director at Unite. And we also want to acknowledge our audience. Please let us know your comments, your thoughts, rebuttals. We want those type of that type of feedback in all the videos that we are posting, so that we can also learn from you. So for some it might be a comfortable conversations, to others it might be uncomfortable, and that's what we want to get to, right? To have that tension so that we can expand and learn and experience. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, Matthew Soerens. Matthew, why don't you introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and why this topic on immigration.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tito. So I guess I start with what I do. I work at an organization called World Relief. That is a global Christian humanitarian organization that operates in a number of countries, including here in the U.S., where in several cities throughout the U.S., we're involved in serving immigrants and resettling refugees. We're actually one of 9 agencies that partners with the U.S. State Department to bring refugees into the country. And I also, in addition to that role with World Relief, I help to coordinate something called the Evangelical Immigration Table. That's a kind of a broader network that World Relief was a part of starting almost 10 years ago now, with the National Association of Evangelicals and the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, and a few other organizations that basically is focused on how do we help the church in the United States think about issues of immigration and respond to both the challenges and the opportunities of immigration in ways that are particularly influenced by the Bible, and then also allowing those biblical principles to inform how we would like elected officials to look at immigration policy issues. So that's my work. I live in a primarily immigrant neighborhood in Aurora, Illinois, about 45 minutes or an hour west of Chicago. In my case, it's mostly a Mexican neighborhood. We've been here for about 5 years. Before that, I lived in a really diverse apartment complex about a half an hour from here that was largely refugees from Southeast Asia and from different parts of Africa, as well as a lot of Mexican immigrants, some Central Americans. So for me, this issue of immigration it's a work issue, it's a policy issue, it's a church issue, but it's also a very personal issue. It's about a lot of my neighbors, both now and for most of my adult life. Going back even before than that, I'm originally from Wisconsin, from a fairly small city where we didn't have a lot of immigrants. I kind of joke, we had this one British kid in my elementary school, and we thought that was very exotic. But beyond that, I think like a lot of Americans in a fairly segregated society, I grew up thinking about immigration either as a historical thing, like Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, or as a political issue we heard about on the news, but not necessarily something that directly affected me. And frankly, even though I grew up in a great church that I'm really grateful for, I don't think I ever thought about immigration as a biblical issue, and nor was I really ever challenged to think about it as a biblical issue.
And it is interesting because years ago I read the book Welcoming the Stranger, and I don't know, I think I read it in a day. It was just incredible information. And there's a part of the book that is talking about a flyer for a candidate for city council in Chicago, in Illinois, Carpentersville, I think it is. And the flyer said something around, are you tired of waiting to pay for your groceries while illegal aliens pay food stamps when they go outside and get in their $40,000 car? And this, perception of the immigrant. Are you tired of seeing the Mexican flag flown above our flag? And this, this was from 2006. And so, can you tell us what is the state of immigration right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my colleague Jenny Yang and I wrote that book. We started it in 2006, 2007, really in part because there was this big national debate around immigration policy. At the time, it was led by President George W. Bush, who was pushing for immigration reforms that at World Relief we supported. But frankly, we were a little bit lonely as an evangelical organization in supporting that sort of immigration reform. I should say some of the Latino evangelical groups were outspoken, but in terms of most white evangelicals, there was just not a lot of there wasn't much of a position one way or the other on any of the immigration policy questions, with some limited exceptions. So, we tried to capture that in starting that book, and then when we updated the book a few years ago, we kept that in there because we felt like, well, that's still pretty much the divide. I mean, on the one hand, you've got that sort of attitude. If anything, it might have gotten more pronounced in the last few years and broadened, because when we wrote the first edition of that book, it was really the big controversial question was, what do we do with undocumented immigrants who are here unlawfully in the country? That question has not gone away, obviously, but I think in some ways it's brought into, should we have immigrants in the country more generally? I mean, refugees have become very controversial. They really weren't back in 2006 and 7 because they all come in with legal status. Kind of by legal definition, refugees have a very sympathetic story. They have fled a credible fear of persecution. But in the last few years, they've joined undocumented immigrants as these uniquely controversial immigrants that Americans and Christians, frankly, are really divided upon, whether they think that they should be here or not. So those questions around legality are still really sensitive and important. But I think in many ways there's a broader question for a lot of American Christians of, do we want to be a nation of immigrants? Is that part of our history that we want to embrace or not? And what is the role of the church in that?
Now, it is interesting that you mentioned about the different types of immigrants that arrive here in this country. So can we give a brief definition of what each of them are? What is the difference between a refugee and an immigrant, for instance, an asylum seeker, and a documented or undocumented? What is DACA?
Sure. Lots of good questions. So, an immigrant, generally speaking, is just someone from one country residing in another country. So that's the broadest possible term. A refugee would be a subset of immigrants. So they are people residing in a different country than their country of birth, but there's for specific reasons under both U.S. law, going back to the Refugee Act of 1980, and then international conventions to which the U.S. is a party. A refugee is defined as someone who is outside of their country of origin, who is unable or unwilling to return to that country because of a well-founded fear of persecution, specifically on account of one's race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So that's a rather precise definition. And if you think about it, that doesn't include someone who's fleeing poverty or fleeing an earthquake or a hurricane or another natural disaster, nor someone who's fleeing sort of general unrest if they can't demonstrate that they're being targeted because of one of those factors under the law. Again, globally, the best estimates is there's somewhere around 26.5 million refugees in the world. So that's actually the largest number since anyone has been tracking numbers. And a very small share of those gets to come to the United States. The number gets set by the president on an annual basis. But last year, and this was affected by COVID, but also by a lot of other factors, it was about 12,000. So 12,000 out of 26 million, you can do the math on that. Most refugees are not coming to the United States, and never were, frankly. Related category is an asylum seeker. So an asylum seeker is someone who professes to be a refugee once they are already in the country they want to stay in. So you can't request asylum in the United States unless you get to the United States, either at the border or you've got like a temporary visa and you're in the country. But before you're being told to return to your country, you're basically saying, I have a credible fear of persecution on account of one of these factors under the law, the very same legal definition. But the burden of proof is on the applicant to prove that they qualify under U.S. law. Until such time as they are granted asylum or lose their case and are deported, they're considered an asylum seeker. So a lot of the dynamics at the border right now are not some people would call those refugees. They may turn out to be refugees in sort of a definition of in fact, but until the government makes that determination, they're considered asylum seekers. And some of them will lose their cases and don't have strong cases under the law as well. They're really fleeing poverty, but some are definitely fleeing persecution. Undocumented basically is there's no perfect term for this because people debate the terms, but it's someone who is unlawfully present in the United States. So there's about, roughly 45 million immigrants in the United States. Probably about 11 million of those are not present lawfully. And that breaks down roughly 50-50 between individuals who entered the country unlawfully, they basically crossed the border without a visa and weren't caught, or another half who entered on some sort of a temporary legal status and overstayed that visa. So that could be a student visa, a tourist visa, a temporary work visa. And also, I think people sometimes hear that idea and they think of Mexico in particular. Mexico is barely 50%, accounts for barely 50% of the undocumented immigrants in the country. So roughly half, but then you've got roughly the other half from every other country in the world. Lots from Central America, but also lots from East Asia and South Asia and Canada. I've had Canadian clients when I practiced legal services. Lots of Polish undocumented folks in the Chicagoland area where I live, and other Europeans. So this is an issue that affects people from all over the world. The last term you mentioned, Tito, is DACA. So DACA is an acronym for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And the other term that sometimes comes up is Dreamers. And that also comes from an acronym. Back in 2001, there was a bill introduced in the U.S. Senate. It was bipartisan. Senator Hatch, Republican from Utah, Senator Durbin from Illinois, Democrat, introduced this bill called the DREAM Act, and it was an acronym. I think everyone's forgotten what it stood for, but basically the idea was we're not going to legalize everyone who's undocumented, but there's this maybe a particular sensitivity to those who were brought to the U.S. as children. You're brought here as a 5-year-old. You didn't really choose to come here as a 5-year-old, so let's let these people earn citizenship. And the DREAM Act basically said you get temporary legal status if you can show that you were here before your 16th birthday. You meet certain other qualifications, obviously, no serious criminal issues, things like that. And then with that temporary legal status, if you finished either 2 years of college or 2 years of military service, you could go on to permanent legal status and then eventual citizenship. Despite having a lot of bipartisan support, that bill never passed into law. And so in 2012, after a number of failures of that legislation, President Obama did what he thought he could do on an executive level. So only Congress can give someone a green card, permanent legal status, because that requires changing a law. But what the President Obama believed he could do, and so far the courts have not said otherwise, is he said, well, I'm going to defer action on these cases. What that basically means is we're going to acknowledge that these people are not here lawfully, but because we have our high priorities for immigration enforcement, serious criminals, terrorists, the Obama administration said recent entrants were high priority. We're also going to have our lowest priorities. And our very lowest priority will be people who are brought here as children, who do not have criminal issues, who are in school or finished school in the U.S. And by acknowledging that, we're deferring action on their case, and that allows us to give them work authorization and temporary legal protections. That wasn't a new idea. Every administration for decades had used deferred action on a kind of case-by-case basis, but the Obama administration did it for a population that was estimated to be more than 1 million people. And ultimately, about 800,000 people actually applied and were granted DACA. And then they renewed it every 2 years. And then the Trump administration in September 2017 announced they were ending DACA, which would mean basically those young people, not all children at this point, many of them are in their 20s or 30s, but who all came as children, they were poised to lose their work authorization, not necessarily to be deported, but at least to be at risk of deportation. And many of them were really concerned about that possibility, understandably. And then the court stepped in and said they weren't sure the Trump administration had ended this in the appropriate way. About a year ago, the Supreme Court said that actually, while they didn't rule on whether DACA was necessarily lawful, they said the way the Trump administration tried to end it, they ruled that the way the Trump administration had tried to end it was not lawful. And so DACA was kept in place for the moment. It's still, as we speak, in place for the moment. But it's still open to legal challenges, and it's real possible that the courts could rule against it at some point.
What is the reality of people crossing the border today or over the years? Or do we have any stats of how many of these people crossing the border are legitimate asylum seekers or criminals?
So the trick with that is, what is a legitimate asylum seeker is somewhat subjective. I mean, a case that goes before one immigration judge might get approved, and the very same case before a different immigration judge might get denied using the same law. And frankly, there in Atlanta, your immigration courts have some of the highest denial rates of anywhere in the country. Whereas if the same case went to New York City, the majority of them would very likely get approved. That's not to say that all cases are created equal or it's entirely just chance, but asylum cases are complicated for a few reasons. One, because in the last 5 years, we've seen a number of changes, not to the law itself, which goes back to 1980, but to how the government was instructed to interpret the law. So, for example, we've seen kind of a back and forth on, I mentioned one of the grounds legally is persecution on account of your social group. Well, what is a social group? I mean, we could probably reasonably disagree on what a social group is, and judges have reasonably disagreed. Is it a social group to be someone fleeing domestic violence, a woman fleeing an abusive husband? Let's say particularly when the local law enforcement are unable or unwilling to protect her. One judge ruled that it was. The Attorney General under the previous administration ruled that actually that was wrong, and said that, no, if you're fleeing persecution on account of your social group, we have to demonstrate that it was persecution perpetrated by the state. If it's from an actor other than the state, a gang, an abusive spouse, a terrorist group, if it's not a state actor, you can't win an asylum claim under that social group ground. The Biden administration then just reversed that in the last few weeks. So that particular change seems maybe, we're talking about just a few words, but it had a huge impact on Central Americans, who were the largest group seeking asylum at the border, many of whom were fleeing either gang violence or domestic violence. Those were the most common citations, and we saw the approval rate go down really significantly. Now, to the question of criminality, the crime is complicated too, because, of course, not all crimes are created equal. It is actually a misdemeanor offense to cross the border unlawfully. You're also not guilty of a crime unless you've been charged with it and found guilty. And plenty of people who did actually, in fact, cross the border unlawfully were never charged with that. So are they a criminal on that basis? I mean, we wouldn't usually consider someone a criminal who's not convicted of a crime. But what most people talk about when they think about crime is not just the violation of the border, crossing the border. And by the way, overstaying a visa unlawfully is not a crime. It's a civil violation. So you're violating a law, but that it's not technically a violation of a criminal statute.
We're entering into the dilemma part of it, but saying, okay, these are people who are breaking the law. And as a lawbreaker, you are a criminal. So, but the technical term for these people is I read years ago that this is the same as a traffic ticket. Is that accurate or not?
Well, in some ways, even that depends on where your traffic ticket violation occurs, because actually Georgia has particularly tough traffic rules. And some of your traffic violations are misdemeanors. In other states, they wouldn't be. So I think all of that goes to the reality that law, I'm not saying law doesn't matter. Law does matter. I think even biblically, we can get to this. We're called to respect the governing authorities. But law is a human construct, and laws change. What is legal in one place can be illegal in another place. The category of an offense, sometimes we'll take into account the motivations for the violation of law. Sometimes it will not. I think when some people hear, there's problems with crime and immigration, they're concerned about violent crime. Like, people are going to come and kill me, rob me, rape me, whatever the, horrible criminal offenses. The reality is, of course, there's some instances where immigrants have committed some of those offenses, but there's consistent data on this that U.S. citizens actually commit violent crime at higher rates than immigrants. That's not to say that no immigrants ever commit crime, but it is not rational for an American citizen to be uniquely afraid of their immigrant neighbors, whether they are lawfully present or not. Which is not to tell you should be afraid of your American citizen neighbors. Again, biblically, we're called to love our neighbors without any caveat, so long as it's completely safe. But it's just not rational to be uniquely afraid of immigrants because the data consistently shows that they actually commit crimes at lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens.
Can you kind of speak to the reality that you've experienced from people you've known who've been impacted by some of the laws and the definitions?
Yeah, not that long ago, I was with some friends of ours who are from Venezuela, which, if any of you are paying attention to the situation in Venezuela right now, it's horrific. I mean, it's an incredibly corrupt government that has, there's lots of reasons to blame, but the levels of poverty from what was once one of the wealthiest countries in South America are just, astounding now. Millions and millions of Venezuelans have fled, primarily not to the United States, but to neighboring countries in South America. So these particular friends, and this was at least 6 months ago because it was in the previous administration, but they have overstayed their visas, and they're living in the United States. They're undocumented at that point. Actually, they're in the process now of applying for temporary protected status, which is a whole other new change in the last month or two. That's going to give them some opportunities and speaks to that dynamic of laws change and opportunities open up. But at the moment, they were here, they're undocumented, they've been here a few years, and they're believers. They're followers of Jesus. They know, Romans chapter 13, be subject to the governing authorities. They want desperately to get right with the law. They've consulted with lawyers and legal counselors who've all gone through their case and basically determined you probably didn't have an asylum claim because even though you were fleeing a bad situation, it wasn't specific persecution because of your political opinion or whatever, and you'd missed the 1-year window to apply because, they didn't know what the rules were when they got here. These are a fairly educated couple, professionals in their country of origin, but here they're working, low-wage jobs that you can get without a Social Security card. And they're really struggling on a theological and biblical, ethical level. They want to be all right with the law. They're not comfortable being here unlawfully. They also know that they're literally providing for their whole extended family with the little bit of money. From our perspective, it would be a fairly low amount of money they're earning in the United States. They live on that here, and they send it back quite a bit to provide for a family facing an incredibly desperate situation. And, the legal questions are important, but it's also not as simple as like, well, what part of illegal don't you understand? It's also, even biblically, 1 Timothy says, if anyone does not provide for his family, and especially his immediate relatives, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And that weighs on them along with this command to be subject to governing authorities. And, honestly, we haven't taken a position at World Relief to say, well, they should go back or they should stay here. We can advise people from a legal perspective, this is what your options are under the law. And sometimes the answer is you don't have options. And sometimes options open up, like temporary protected status for Venezuelans. But what we've advocated for a long time at World Relief is because of our interaction at the level of individual people, there ought to be a solution at a policy level that both honors the law and is compassionate and keeps families together. So we've said, we're not saying it has to be an amnesty that just ignores that there was a violation of law. We're acknowledging that people have violated immigration laws for complex reasons, often under duress. I'm sympathetic to some of those reasons, but we ought to be able to acknowledge, there was a law violated here. But the question then isn't just, should we shun those people? First of all, the church is under no legal restrictions to minister to those people. There's not something in the law that prevents us from ministering to people whom we suspect may be undocumented. But on a policy level then, what we've said is instead of an amnesty that just says you've broken the law but it's forgiven and forgotten, what's an appropriate penalty? And what we've said is there ought to be some sort of restitution that people could pay, a fine that people could be able to pay to earn the chance to stay lawfully in the United States and eventually, if they want to go through the process, become citizens. And we find that's actually a pretty common sense proposal that a really broad range of Christians can get behind, a broad range of Americans. That's basically, we didn't come up with this. That was President Bush's proposal. It was President Obama's proposal. So it historically hasn't been this hyper-partisan thing. But unfortunately, I think in recent years it has become more partisan, and our goal has really been to say, let's take a step back from the political partisanship, at least, and say, how do we approach this issue, first and foremost, as a human issue and as a biblical issue?
I believe that there's a spiritual warfare going on in the church, and it's been going on for decades now, between what my upbringing, what my politics, my experience say, and now what my faith is telling me. How do I reconcile these two? There's a huge dilemma going on right now in the church in America?
First of all, if our cultural values and our biblical faith are coming into tension, it's not hard to know which to choose. We should be going with what do the scriptures say. But also, I think sometimes people think that there's a tension that's not necessarily there. And this goes to, like they would actually say, well, it is a biblical tension. We have Romans 13 on one side, obey the government, which is a little simplistic understanding of Romans 13. But we can go into that later. And then, we will go to the Bible later. But all these verses about loving and welcoming people, wanting to share the gospel with people. So which one should we do? Should we obey the law or should we love and welcome people? And people are stuck with this sort of paralysis of, I'm not sure what the right answer is. And I know the answer. It's yes. And the good news is there's nothing in the law. If we're going to take Romans 13 seriously, then we have to know what the governing authorities say. And most people haven't gone that far to look at the Immigration and Nationality Act, which I kind of understand because the Immigration and Nationality Act is like a super thick book. It's bigger than your Bible and far less interesting. But it actually doesn't have much to say to a church or to a native-born U.S. citizen who isn't subject to most of these immigration laws. There's a few dynamics that come into play, but in terms of can I be friends with my neighbor who I suspect might be here unlawfully? Yes, you can. Can I invite them over for a meal and get to know them and, share the gospel with them, or let them share the gospel with me, which might be just as likely? Yes, you can. Can you run an English class out of your church or a food pantry or share the gospel with people or baptize them or serve them communion? Even if you suspect that they might be here unlawfully, there's not a problem with that. Where you could get into a tension point is, are you going to employ them? So that is a black and white legal issue that gets complicated for some churches and denominations. But for the vast majority of individuals and churches who are just asking, can we minister to these people? The answer is yes. And we should be on guard against any sort of restrictions on our religious liberty that would prevent us from doing so in the future. But I don't think we're actually at that point in terms of the state of the law in the United States or in most states. Now, of course, that's harder for our sisters and brothers in Christ who are undocumented, who are wrestling with that Romans 13 challenge themselves. And that's where I think we do need some changes to law. But I think a lot of the dilemma that people feel is sort of, should I even go near this issue? And the questions around ministry are really not the dilemma that I think people sometimes presume they are without a familiarity with immigration law.
So the rhetoric that I hear is, President Biden is kind of importing lots of people from different countries, and he's moving them into small towns and bringing criminals who are, and I mean, we kind of spoke, but it's like they're going to rape our kids, bring drugs. This is like the secret way that drug lords sneak into the country, those kinds of things. I'm just curious, where do we get that? Or how do we even speak to that from a place where someone's not like, well, no, you just don't really know, or your information is coming from the wrong place. I don't know. I'd just love for you to speak to that, because it's a very real conversation I've had in the last 6 months with people.
The level of misinformation around immigration issues is extremely high. And I mean, social media has just exacerbated that, because there's not even the pretext of a fact check. It's just, well, I heard this. Where'd you hear that from? Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And I maybe shouldn't say obviously, but the sort of things that you're hearing people ask about Ruth, I have heard as well, and they're not accurate. I mean, first of all, there's no importation policy for immigrants. Lots of people want to come to the United States. That's true. That has been true for several hundred years now. That is an incredible compliment to the United States, that we are a country that people want to come to. We've got a lot going for us, both in terms of our economy and in terms of relative safety and security and rule of law. I mean, those are all good things that mostly work pretty well here. Not perfectly, not equally for everyone, but better than a lot of other places in the world. And that is a blessing that we who happen to have been born in this country should be really grateful for. So lots of people want to come to this country because they're fleeing poverty or violence. Almost nobody's coming casually because they think it might be interesting. There's usually something pushing people out. And we're primarily seeing people from Central America in recent years showing up at the southern border speaks actually to the particular dynamics in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, a little bit less El Salvador in the last year or so, in Nicaragua, where I spent a significant amount of time when I first started with World Relief, and which is in a political mess right now with a lot of really challenging dynamics. But all those dynamics, people are leaving their countries on this idea that the United States offers safety and protection and opportunity, which, for better or worse, that's sort of our slogan. We've got the Statue of Liberty still in New York Harbor with that poem from Emma Lazarus saying, "Give me your tired, your poor, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free." And people come to claim that promise. The reality is that's not been fully true really since Emma Lazarus wrote that in 1882. That was about the time that, for example, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act restricting particular categories of immigrants based on their country of origin. But it's been true for a lot of people, and it's still true for some people. And, I don't think we should be surprised that people want to claim that. It's human nature, and driven by some good biblical impulses to want to provide for your family and protect your family. There's so many misconceptions there. I think in terms of how do we address it, if I could, I would want everyone who is concerned about those things to just come meet one of the immigrants at my church. And by the way, most immigrants to this country are Christians of one category or another. At least they affiliate themselves either with a Protestant denomination or with the Catholic Church, for the most part. So it's a pretty small minority that don't. But and my church is full of amazing people, and there's churches like that around the country and throughout the Atlanta area of people who are doing their best to provide for their families, to make a better life for their families, just like most of us born in this country. And if we could help facilitate some of those relationships, and that's something we're really passionate about at World Relief. I mean, our primary ministry, we were meeting a lot of direct needs when a refugee family arrives or an asylum seeker family arrives. But one of our primary ministries is facilitating mutual relationships, which ends up, I think, being how we slowly transform some of the mistaken attitudes that are pretty common in a lot of corners of the American church right now.
So that's the one side of the coin. The other side is what scriptures say, right? Is there a mandate that we can find in the scriptures for with respect to the immigrant?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tito. We've kind of started the conversation, and the scripture that I've mentioned most often is probably the scripture that a lot of evangelical Christians start with when they think about immigration, which is Romans 13, and how do we think about the law? And that's relevant. We should get there. But to quote Daniel Carroll, who's an Old Testament scholar over at Wheaton College, a lot of Christians start the conversation biblically on Romans 13, and they never get to anywhere else. And the irony is the Bible has so much to say, not just about how we relate to governing authorities, but specifically about how to treat immigrants. Or depending upon which Bible translation we're reading, you might see the word foreigner, stranger, sojourner, alien. The Hebrew word in the Old Testament is the word ger, and it appears 92 times in the Old Testament. Like, this is a frequent theme. So to the question of, is there anything the Bible says on this, there's way more than we're going to have time to talk about in a 45 or minute or hour-long conversation. But I think a few big themes that I would mention. One, to go to the very beginning of the scriptures, where we ought to start, is that immigrants are people made in the image of God. And that means they have inherent dignity. Christians have historically understood that idea of people being made in God's image to mean that every human person, regardless of any qualifier, ethnicity or gender or country of origin or anything else we might consider about someone, if they're a human person, they have value and dignity. And that, of course, in itself would give us a strong reason to want to protect someone fleeing persecution or harm, which is, around those situations of refugees or asylum seekers. And also related to human dignity, it's not just human dignity, it's also human potential, because human beings are made in the image of a creator God with the potential to create and to contribute. In fact, that's part of the mandate that human beings are given at creation. And that's true for all human beings, not just immigrants. But I think sometimes when we talk about immigrants, as sort of in the political dialogue, so quickly our minds go to, what is this going to cost us? How much are they going to take? And those economic questions, which are fair questions. But the irony is we only ask what are they going to take, and we forget to ask what are they going to contribute. And precisely because they are people made in the image of a creator God, they are likely to create some jobs in addition to taking some jobs. In fact, 44% of the Fortune 500 companies in this country were founded by an immigrant or their child. All sorts of American companies that employ hundreds of thousands and probably millions of people wouldn't be American companies at all if it wasn't for our country's history of immigration. And that's true. That's not just big companies. It's small businesses. It's true at a fiscal level. I mean, sometimes there's this question of, well, can we afford this? Those people are going to take, it costs money to send that kid to kindergarten. It costs money when somebody's in a healthcare emergency and they go to the emergency room and then they get treated. That's true. There are costs there. But there also are contributions. And when economists look at the contributions and the costs, the vast majority of economists think that the net economic impact for the United States of immigration overall, and actually also specifically for illegal immigration, is positive. In fact, 96% of economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal said that about illegal immigration, that the net economic impact is positive. Or if you go back to refugees, again, so separate category, they get more help from the government when they first come in than most other categories of immigrants. So, there are more costs for the taxpayer, but they also are taxpayers themselves. And the longer you give them here, the more they pay taxes. 20 years after arrival, the average refugee adult, according to some economists at Notre Dame, has paid in $21,000 more in taxes at all levels than the combined cost of governmental expenditures on their behalf. I mean, that goes back to that biblical principle that human beings, including immigrants, are made in God's image with potential and with dignity. Now, another major theme biblically is just, if you go through the Old Testament in particular, you're going to see that word for an immigrant, the word ger, alongside the orphan and the widow, over and over and over again. There's these uniquely vulnerable people in that context, and I think you could argue still in our context today, whom God identifies specifically as being vulnerable to injustice, and whom he says he loves, and whom he then commands his people to love. We see that in Deuteronomy 10, we see it in Leviticus 19. Often that's paired with this reminder to the people of Israel that they were themselves foreigners in the land of Egypt. They know how it feels to be mistreated because that was their experience or their ancestors' experience, which again should probably resonate with those of us who are Americans and are not completely Native American, because we can trace our ancestry from somewhere else, whether that was on the Mayflower or on a slave ship in a forced migration, whether that was across a border or on an airplane through into Ellis Island, wherever our family stories go. Most of us know a little bit about those stories, and I think especially for those of us from a European ancestry, we kind of have this particular, I'm Dutch. We were talking about this before we started recording. My parents have the windmill in front of their house and the little wooden shoes, and we're very proud of our frugality, which is somehow associated with our ethnic origins. That's great. I'm all for those things. Tulips, all that. But sometimes we remember the really nice parts about our sort of immigrant ancestry, and we forget the hard parts. We forget the mistreatment that most European immigrant groups, to say nothing even more so of Asian and Africans and of those from other parts of the world, went through at different points in our country's history. Whether that's the Germans in the very beginning of the country, or the Irish, or the Italians, whom at one point a congressional commission determined were just biologically inferior to Western Europeans. It's not even their fault, it's in their DNA. But on that account, we've got to restrict the Italians. They're prone to criminality. That was the determination of our Congress. You can look at various groups of people who were determined to be the wrong kinds of immigrants at different points in our history and were mistreated. And I think the challenge of Scripture is not to remember that so you can be just as terrible to the newcomers as they were to your people, but to be better than that. To basically, God tells the Israelites, you have to remember that you were mistreated under Pharaoh and that it was my grace that brought you from that place of desperation in Egypt where you are now. Because if you forget that, you'll turn to the people who come after you and you'll be just as terrible to them as Pharaoh was to you. One last, we could go through so many biblical themes here because it's like a mega theme. I think Sam George, who's a missiologist with Lausanne, says it's one of the mega themes of the Bible is migration. If you think about just all the characters of the stories of Scripture who were crossing a border at one point or another, I won't go into all of them, but there's so many of those. But another theme, and this gets into the New Testament as well as the Old, is just the theme of hospitality, which, is kind of one of those nice Bible words. I think most of our churches have a hospitality committee that makes coffee, which, my church doesn't make the best coffee, but we're working on that. Or maybe people think of hospitality as an industry, hotels, restaurants, cruise ships, theme parks. But really, if you look at hospitality or I should also say this, sometimes hospitality also is somehow pigeonholed as this uniquely feminine virtue. There's a lot more women's conferences on the theme of hospitality than there are men's conferences. And I don't think there's necessarily any biblical justification for that. Because hospitality, and not that, making muffins or something is uniquely a feminine characteristic either, but it actually is not about food. It's not about any of those dynamics. It's in the Greek, it's philoxenia. It is the love of strangers. It is precisely the opposite of xenophobia, which is the fear of strangers. So, in fact, we're told in 1 Timothy and Titus that if you want to be a leader in the church, one of the requirements, it comes right before preaching in one of those passages, and being a good expositor of the word, is to be hospitable, to be a lover of strangers. We're told in Romans 12 to practice hospitality, to literally practice loving strangers. In Hebrews 13, it says that when we do so, some people have entertained angels without realizing it, which introduces this idea that immigrants or other strangers could actually be a divinely sent blessing, not something that we should be afraid of. And it's not because the Bible promises that all strangers are safe. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that that's some proof text somewhere, or if you read Malachi backwards 3 times, it'll tell you that. But it does tell us that we're commanded to practice loving strangers. And I think that we've gotten away from that as a biblical mandate. I think that there's incredible opportunities for the church by doing a better job of embracing immigrants. And we're seeing the fastest growth in most streams of American Christianity in immigrant congregations. And I also think among like a younger demographic, a lot of the people who are walking away from the church are put off by the fact that the church doesn't engage these issues. So long term, I actually think this is probably not a bad strategy for church growth and evangelism. But in the short term, it will cause some heartburn. Although there are ways to do it sensitively. I mean, what I've always said is don't make this about Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Or, I mean, I've been doing this long enough. It was don't make this about George W. Bush or Barack Obama, or, I've been at this for a while. Make it about the Bible, make it about mission, make it about people. And people can come to their own conclusions on the policy questions. Those obviously matter a great deal. They affect people. But I don't think as Christians that's where we should be starting the conversation. We should be starting with what does the Bible say. And I find in a church context, when we do that, the vast majority of people are willing to go there. Not 100%, but the majority of people, we frame this biblically, and we've created tons of resources at World Relief, at the Evangelical Immigration Table. We really want to help people enter into this conversation from a biblical perspective. But real quickly, you asked, so what's the Christian response? Is so that I don't forget anything, we've used this acronym of PLEASE. The first letter there stands for prayer. And that's not just because LEASE wasn't a great acronym, but prayer ought to be where we start any hard conversation in the church, and how we think about any complex issue. Praying for immigrants, praying for those who are desperate and thinking about should they leave their country because it's gotten so hard, praying for the response of our church, praying for our elected officials. We're told to pray for kings and all those in authority. So whether you like your senators or your president or your members of Congress or not, we should be praying for them. And I'm certainly guilty of complaining about what happens in Washington a little bit more than I pray for Washington. The L in that acronym is listening. And I would say listening to 2 primary sources. First and foremost, to the Bible. One of the discipleship tools we put together probably almost 10 years ago, and we've kept using it because it's very simple. It's a 40-day Bible reading guide called the I Was a Stranger Challenge. It's just 40 Bible verses. It doesn't tell you how to interpret those verses, doesn't tell you who to vote for. The challenge is, would you read the Bible? And that's pretty simple, but we've had lots of people do that and come back and say, wow, I had no idea that the Bible said so much on this. And you can find that at the Evangelical Immigration Table website. It's also on the Bible.com, YouVersionsBible.com app. So you can do it in any language, any translation you want. But that's a great tool. And then, to go deeper, we've got an ebook called Thinking Biblically about Immigrants and Immigration Reform that's free on the Evangelical Immigration Table website. The book that Jenny Yang and I wrote, Welcoming Strangers, good resource. There's a bunch of good resources, though. I mentioned Danny Carroll, Wheaton College. His book, The Bible and Borders, is a great kind of deep theological resource. I just did a foreword for a book that I really found valuable called Refuge Reimagined by actually scholars, one in Canada and one in Australia, which is almost refreshing because they're just talking about the Bible. They're kind of uninterested in the U.S. political dynamics, which so quickly becomes the starting point in the U.S. Anyway, that's listening to the Bible first and foremost, but secondly, listening to immigrants themselves. I mean, for me, it's the people who I go to church with, who are my neighbors, literally. Their stories have definitely transformed the way I think about this topic. The E in that acronym is empowering churches abroad. Because as I said, migration is usually a response to something bad. It is a decision that people make often under some sort of duress. And while I'm all for the church welcoming as many people as we can, I also think it's a tragedy that there are so many people who felt they have no choice but to leave their countries. And that's something the church can do something about. And the church is doing something about in a lot of contexts. Central America is a great example. It's a largely Christian part of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa is another place, and World Relief does a ton of work in Africa, coming alongside local churches to address those root causes that fuel migration, whether conflict or war or poverty, natural disasters, environmental degradation. So empowering churches abroad is sort of getting ahead of the dynamic of immigration, and is something the church ought to be about. The A in that acronym of PLEASE is advocacy. Advocacy is where people get uncomfortable because that sounds a little bit like politics. And I would say this, we're really clear, World Relief, we should never be partisan. We should never think that one party should be defining our values. Our values should come from the scriptures. But that doesn't necessarily mean we cannot possibly avoid every political issue if that means avoiding every issue that affects people in our society. And the Bible speaks too specifically to how to treat immigrants to say, well, we're not going to do anything around immigrants. We would be ignoring huge swaths of our community. One definition biblically of advocacy is Proverbs 31, verse 8, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I always want to be careful how we use that passage because I just told you to listen to immigrants. So clearly, immigrants are not people who cannot speak for themselves. But in a public policy sense, in a democratic form of government, our elected officials who are in positions of influence to change policies are usually pretty uninterested in what non-citizens who cannot vote think. But they're probably more interested than you realize in the views of citizens who can vote. And advocacy doesn't mean, baptizing one party's platform or the other, but it's asking people in both parties to pursue public policies that are rooted in biblical values. And we've done that at World Relief in partnership with a number of organizations at the Evangelical Immigration Table by putting some basic principles together. And you can find those at evangelicalmigrationtable.com. And affirm those. If you say, hey, I want to advocate, one simple step is you could say, I can affirm this statement of principles that's saying, yes, we should affirm the dignity of every person. We should keep families together whenever possible. We should be fair to taxpayers. We should ensure secure borders. That's an appropriate function of government, to keep out anyone seeking to do wrong and do everything reasonably possible there. But we should also establish a path towards legal status and or citizenship for those willing to do that restitution process that I discussed. The S in that acronym of PLEASE is serving locally. There's all sorts of very tangible needs in immigrant communities. And in the Atlanta area in particular, there's a very large immigrant population, a very diverse immigrant population, and all sorts of practical needs. And that's going to vary from one neighborhood to another, what those needs look like. It might be around newly arrived refugees. It might be with asylum seekers who don't have any of the governmental kind of safety net that the refugees might have. Might be around the people who have been here for 20 years and are undocumented. And you throw in a pandemic to all that, and the challenges are even further exacerbated. But there's lots of ways, and again, without violating any laws, that churches can be directly involved in ministering to needs, and doing so alongside immigrant congregations, which are often on the forefront of this. And then the last piece is evangelism. I should be really clear. A lot of immigrants, you share the gospel with them, they're going to share the gospel right back at you, and might have a lot to teach some of us native-born Americans about faithfulness to Jesus and relying on Jesus through really challenging circumstances. But there are others who do not yet know Jesus. In fact, there's people from entirely unreached people groups. The Southern Baptist International Mission Board has this assessment. They found that there are more unreached people groups present in the boundaries of the United States than in any other country besides India or China. And we spend all sorts of resources and time strategizing, how do we send people to these countries with no religious freedom? And I'm all for that strategy. But we're missing something profound if we don't notice that God in his sovereignty has sent people from all those nations to the United States, to Atlanta, to a context where we are blessed with religious freedom, where we can share our faith and people are free to receive it or to reject it. And again, we're not doing proselytism. We're not tricking people into following Jesus. At World Relief, we would never say we're going to serve you at this higher level if you pray this prayer. That's not our view of evangelism. But true evangelism is an open invitation. And often that comes in response to a question. Because when it's a team from a church that welcomes a Muslim family at the airport and loves them as their neighbor, which we are called to do whether they would ever share our faith or not. But when we do that part well, it's rare that sooner or later they don't ask the question of why. And we get to it, 1 Peter says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you. And we've seen people of various religious backgrounds and of nominal religious backgrounds come into a deep relationship with Jesus when they are loved and welcomed by the local church. But the risk is that that's not their impression of followers of Jesus. That what they've heard of followers of Jesus is those are the people who want to keep them out. Those are the people who are saying things that are untrue about their people or their parents, and maligning them and slandering them. And that is a pretty terrible witness for the church, and really a handicap to wanting to make disciples among all nations.
I'm a son of Korean immigrants to this country, and one of the things that sort of, my parents have actually had the chance to move back to Korea. And one of the things that's reflected now in sort of the current political climate and the posture towards immigrants in the United States, it feels very different from when they were welcome to the country, when they were allowed. And as a part of Christian witness, my parents, they came to faith here in this country. My father was called into ministry to raise up immigrant churches, and he's pastored or planted, I think, 7 to 9 immigrant churches in the Southeast. And so just the fact that the country feels different, like it feels like it just does something to the Christian witness, like, it's sort of disappointing. It's like seeing your big brother make mistakes that he didn't used to make, or where he was once a real leader and a real discipler, and then they just suddenly fall back on their faith, and you're like, oh, but you led me to Christ, you led me to believe and fight for these things, and now if I were to come to this country now, might not make it, or would be denied, or seen very differently, or seen suspiciously. So there really is a sense that that the Christian America that isn't the same. So there's a real chance for collective witness, like what you're saying here is like, if you play the long run, we can really proclaim Christ without having to expend so much energy. Just who we are and how we welcome one another is a huge, huge testimony.
I have seen over the years, I've lived in this country for 25 years. I am from Nicaragua, by the way. And I know you've mentioned Nicaragua a few times during this conversation. And I've seen over these 25 years living in this country, the good, the bad, and the ugly on the topic of immigration. I've seen business owners contacting me so that I could serve as an interpreter to this Latino employee who doesn't speak any English, and they want to do as a business everything possible to give him a work visa and to bring his family to the United States. And the business owner wanted me to make sure that his employee knew that the moment he get his green card, he's not required to stay with the company. He can do whatever he wants. The beauty of that, church members who are Anglos asking me, how can I help my fellow Latino immigrants? And sometimes those questions are still without an answer. And but just the fact that you gave us this acronym and to give us an opportunity as pastors and as leaders to engage. But Matthew, thank you so much for being here with us and for shedding a light on this issue.
Yeah, it's been an honor to be with you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
We want to thank you for tuning in. Please keep your eyes open for future conversations in the interaction, the cross-section between leadership and flourishing.